which we chose because photosynthesis is everywhere. I mean, without it, we wouldn't be able to eat, we wouldn't be able to survive, and we wouldn't be able to breathe. I mean, you can just look outside and see the trees that are photosynthesizing as we speak.
Yep, and I'm Quentin, by the way, and this is Maggie.
Oh, yeah, that's
And another reason that we did photosynthesis was, you know, it's really fun, and I had this memory of back in sophomore biology, there's this really fun song that Foy played, and let's see if we can get YouTube to
We're
work.
gonna play it for you.
You might want to turn up the...
If you want to know how a plant grows, it takes water, air and sunlight and makes cellulose. Every plant can do this fundamental process, and we can call this photosynthesis. Unlike me and you, plants need CO2, and they make oxygen that stops us turning blue. Every plant can do this fundamental process, and we can call this photosynthesis.
Alright, we don't need to watch the whole thing, but that's just gets you back into the mood of, let's see, how do we present this? Yeah, there we go. Alright, so that was just to get you into the mood of photosynthesis, and why, for me, I chose that because, you know, I was walking through the halls being a senior, thinking back on all my fond memories here, and I thought of the photosynthesis song, and I said, hey, why don't we do the calculus on that?
Alright, okay, so to start you out, I hope you all know what photosynthesis is, but to refresh. Photosynthesis is the process by which plants use sunlight energy to produce chemical energy, which ends up being glucose or cellulose, if you want to be more scientific about it. It's from the Greek photo, meaning light, and synthesis, meaning composition. And the term was coined by Charles Barnes in 1893, who actually preferred the term photosyntax, but it was later changed as everybody liked photosynthesis a lot better. He was German, by the way. And how photosynthesis occurs is cells in the leaves of plants and some forms of algae have organelles called chloroplasts, which contain chlorophyll. Here, light and carbon dioxide are absorbed and water is taken in through the roots. And following the equation below, glucose and oxygen are produced. So basically it just takes carbon dioxide, water, and spits out glucose and oxygen. Okay. Actually, the discovery of photosynthesis has a very interesting timeline. The early belief was that plants gained everything that they got to grow just from the soil alone. And it was first researched by Jan Baptista von Helmont in 1648, who concluded that plants gain nutrients from water. He had this little pine tree in his yard, and he would water it every day. And he measured the soil when he first planted it, and then would measure it according. And he realized that the soil never actually changed weight, so it wasn't gaining or losing nutrients for the tree to grow. Sorry. So he concluded that it would have gained its mass from the water. In 1771, Joseph Priestley believed that this chemical or noxious gas called phlogiston was released into the air after combustion. He found that a mouse could not survive in phlogisticated air alone, but it could survive with a mint sprig. Basically, he put the mouse with a candle in a little container, and go bad for those mice. In 1779, Jan Ingenhousz found that the green parts of plants dephlogisticate the air, but only in sunlight, and it actually produced phlogiston in the dark. Okay, here's some more history. In 1783, Antoine Lavoisier discovered that animals and fire both consume a gas that he named oxygen, which the green parts of the plants release, and that was kind of the start of abandoning this phlogiston theory. In 1796, he abandoned, Ingenhousz abandoned his phlogiston theory and hypothesized that plants split the carbon dioxide that they gain through the leaves and use the carbon for growth and then expel CO2, or not CO2, expel oxygen. In 1941, Samuel Rubin and Martin Kamen, using the ideas of Cornelius van Meel, found that the oxygen produced was actually from the split water and not from the carbon dioxide. And that had to do with the different isotopes in the water and in the carbon. History of rates. And the word that we get for rate came from the 14th and 15th centuries in Europe. It was from medieval Latin rata, which meant part. And it's the origin of the first use of actual rates. People that would compare things using ratios. It's undocumented because it's practically been around forever. And a rate is essentially a ratio that compares two measurements with different units. So you would have miles to hour or gallons to second. And it a lot of the times has to do with time, but not always. And a rate with 1 in the denominator is called a unit rate. So like you would have miles per 1 hour. And in calculus, the slopes of tangent lines are found by finding the change in the x values, delta x, compared to the change in y values, delta y. And this is essentially half of calculus right there. I mean, all a slope is really is it shows you how far the x has moved and how far the y has moved, and finding those rates is very central to calculus. And fun fact, the background here is actually a section from Newton's Principia Mathematica, which is the book that he wrote when he was documenting all of his research in calculus.
Okay, so why Miggy gave us the history of rates is because rates are everywhere in photosynthesis. So one of them, photosynthesis throughout the day, can be expressed by the function y equals 2.4 divided by 2 times the sine of 2 pi over 24x. And this gives you the photosynthesis for the day from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., so that 12-hour span. And then, so this is the graph of that function. And if you were to take the integral of that to find the total amount of grams produced throughout that day, you would end up with 9.167 grams produced through photosynthesis from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. just through your average photosynthesis and through the average rate in the chlorophyll. However, it's not always that easy, because there are several factors that can play into photosynthesis. The three major ones are light intensity, the CO2 that's in the atmosphere, and the temperature. And then these are some of the graphs that commonly play out with photosynthesis and how they affect the photosynthetic rate. So the first factor is the light intensity. So as you can see, as light intensity increases, the photosynthetic rate also increases. However, it limits out at 0.5% photosynthesis. And then the next factor that we have is the amount of CO2. And here on this graph we have 3 different levels of CO2. The first bottom equation there is the CO2 rate at 140 parts per million. So that means that there's 140 CO2 in every million parts of the atmosphere. And that can be given here. And the photon irritants, that is just how often that the plant is getting hit with that CO2. So as that goes up to 2000, you can see that the CO2 absorption also goes up, but it stalls out about at 9. And using the trapezoidal rule, we can find that we can find that the total absorption of CO2 is about 19,366.667 moles absorbed through that 2,000 irritants. And so the next part would be if the CO2 was at 350 parts per million. And the 350 parts per million is what the average CO2 is in the actual atmosphere. So that is what we deal with day to day. And once again, using the trapezoidal rule, we get about 59,662.5 moles of CO2 absorbed. And the last CO2 factor is if the CO2 was at 1,000 parts per million. And this is obviously nearly doubled what it would be normally. And using the trapezoidal rule again, we get about 90,144.44 moles of CO2 absorbed. So comparing that to the 140 parts per million that was just at about 20,000, and then the 350, which is the actual amount, which was at 52, we can see that it's greatly increased as the CO2 increases, which we would suspect if you were to increase CO2, you would have more CO2 absorption. And the last factor that can affect photosynthesis is the temperature. And here, once again, the 250 or 225 parts per million of CO2, that's just the average CO2. And then here, down here is the leaf temperature, and over there is the photosynthetic rate. And you can see here that it stalls out about at the temperature of 25 degrees Celsius, which equals 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that means that the optimum temperature for photosynthesis with your average CO2 parts per million is at 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And say that the CO2 was increased again to 1,935 parts per million. You can see that the optimum temperature greatly increases along with the rate also greatly increasing. And here instead we have a maximum at 37 degrees Celsius, which gives a photosynthesis of 39 moles per second. And that means, in Fahrenheit wise, it's about 98.8 degrees would be the optimum temperature if the CO2 were to rise to that amount.
Okay, we conducted a small experiment to help show rates of photosynthesis just down the stock serum. We filled a beaker with a solution of water and about 1% of sodium bicarbonate, which is more commonly known as just baking soda. And we placed 3.03 grams of alodia, which is a plant that photosynthesizes rather quickly, and you can find it in most pet stores because it's most commonly used as decoration in fish tanks. That one is not alodia, but it looks nice. Helps kind of to oxygenate the water so that the little fishies can breathe. And we placed the alodia under a funnel submerged in the solution, and then we filled a test tube with that same solution just to keep everything the same. And we overturned it onto the funnel. So if you can imagine, so that the alodia would be trapped in this. And we placed the beaker in sunlight for 10 minutes and captured the oxygen released in the test tube, and which formed a hemisphere bubble on the top with a diameter of 6 millimeters. Okay. And using the formula for the volume of a hemisphere, which is just half the volume of a regular sphere, the amount of oxygen produced was about 56.55 millimeters cubed. And so that would mean that the Elodia was producing at a rate of about 5.65 millimeters cubed per minute of oxygen for that 3.03 grams of Elodia, and which means that 1 gram would produce at a rate of about 1.86629 millimeters cubed. And that sounds like a lot, but now it's time for a little bit of fun facts to kind of put that amount in perspective. The average lung capacity of a human adult male is about 6 liters, so take a breath. In normal air, regular air that we breathe at about standard temperature and pressure, is only about 20.8% oxygen. Most of it is nitrogen, and there's a little bit of carbon dioxide and other gases that make up the air that we breathe. Therefore, in one lung full of air, full lung full, only about 1.2 liters is oxygen. And so if you only had 1 gram of Elodia, it would take about a year and a little over 3 months to produce that much oxygen. So it doesn't produce oxygen very fast, but that's why we have lots of plants.
Alright, and now for the history of the trapezoidal rule, since we use that to configure how the rising and lowering the CO2 count would be, how that would affect photosynthesis. So here you have the trapezoidal rule, and it was first discovered by Newton and Coates, and it was part of the Newton and Coates formulas, which included several others, but the trapezoidal rule was one of the main ones. And the trapezoidal rule is used as a more easier and more effective way to estimate the area under the curve without actually doing all the integration with it.
And easier and more effective as opposed to Riemann-Sums.
Yeah. Yep. And then other applications for our math include the trapezoidal rule, and the trapezoidal rule can be used with any graph or data table. And you just plot the points, throw them in, and it's as simple as that. And it also can also estimate the area under the curve instead of using integrals. And then we can also use other implications of rates, and rates are everywhere. Anytime you have miles per hour, meters per second, there's a rate, that's where you can apply it to. So do we have any questions?